All right, and welcome to another edition of the Five Star Podcast of Wrestling. I'm your host, Sean Meyers, joined by a returning Sean Saputo. Sean, after a week absence, glad to have you back. I know that we didn't have a chance, you and I, to talk about the fallout from WrestleMania. Justin Lowry did a great job filling in that regard, but the 2 days after WrestleMania have become very significant. The Raw and SmackDown have become some of the biggest shows of the year, where they have superstars debuting, superstars returning, and really kicking off a brand new set of storylines. Then the following week, this past week, they went with the Superstar Shakeup. So the interesting thing about the Shakeup is that you get a ton of movement. And really, when you look at how they've handled it the last 2 years, you have probably about 20 total people moving, maybe even more than that. To me, it's not really conducive for the best television possible. There's just too many moving parts. People lose track. And then you really don't have that true feel of Raw is its own brand with a unique roster, SmackDown its own brand, because guys switch back and forth so much that they really don't have that loyalty to a particular brand like it was years ago, where I thought it was done better. Justin and I talked last week about how poorly it was handled with just people randomly appearing without any explanation last year. They did it again this year. What was your reaction on how they went about the Superstar Shakeup before we get into the individual transactions?
See, I'm not a fan of the Superstar Shakeup, so to speak. I was more of a fan of the draft back that they had maybe, 5 to 10 years ago. Just because the draft allowed you to know who was exactly moving where, and there were a select few parts that moved. It wasn't a complete jumbled mess with 15 superstars moving to each brand. And also the draft led to more interesting television, because matches were put in place between both promotions to collect a draft pick. And you always had some interesting draft picks. I mean, 2005 after WrestleMania, John Cena and Batista beginning their runs. John Cena flips the Monday Night Raw as the first pick, and then it took a little bit before Batista ended up going to SmackDown. I mean, you knew it was going to happen, but it added to that intrigue. And with the Superstar Shakeup, it's kind of like, oh, who's this guy going to face? And then, it's okay, so now they're on SmackDown. And the thing with the Superstar Shakeup is a lot of pieces that moved this year were currently, especially on Monday Night Raw, involved in what was going to be an important storyline. And then next thing you know, they're on SmackDown. So it created so much confusion with, I'll start with Samoa Joe for complete instance. Samoa Joe, the past 2 weeks since he's returned, has come out on Monday Night Raw, and he's done nothing but call out Roman Reigns, saying, I'm going to beat Roman Reigns at Backlash, after he loses to Brock Lesnar. Well, now he's on SmackDown. So what importance does that storyline really hold anymore? Because with AJ Styles not moving to Monday Night Raw, my whole thought process of the move with Samoa Joe was, okay, Samoa Joe is going to go to SmackDown. AJ Styles is going to be like The Miz. Miz moved to SmackDown while on Raw. I think AJ Styles might be that last piece that moves to Monday Night Raw, and then you have Joe bring the Universal title over to SmackDown, and you have a flip-flop with the titles. But now it's caused so much confusion as to where storylines lie.
The one thing that Justin and I highlighted last week that we hope they would avoid is just people show up, there's no explanation. We don't get the feel that these are actual trades or that the GMs or commissioners have any role in it whatsoever, because there's no explanation for it. And the way I would have gone about it was make it more like real sports, where you have one person traded for one other person, they clearly lay it out, and then you can sort of gauge how they view the value of a particular superstar. And Justin brought up the idea maybe you do a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 trade, or when you want to get a tag team, maybe you have to give up some other superstars to balance it out. I don't understand why they went about the way they did it, because basically if you're watching Raw, you see maybe 10 new superstars that come over from SmackDown, 4 or 5 others that don't even make it on the show, but you find out later online that they also came across guys like the Ascension, for instance. And then the really confusing thing, where logic completely goes out the window, is that you have a handful of superstars who wrestle on Raw as members of the Raw brand, and then you find out the next night they're on SmackDown. So if these trades were already made, where people are coming from SmackDown to Raw in exchange for Raw superstars going to SmackDown, why are those Raw competitors even still wrestling on the show? Now, I know they sort of explained that with The Miz, giving him the send-off, saying it's your last match, so on and so forth. But logistically, it doesn't make sense. And to me, that's something they should address to make it more like real-life sports. And I brought up the idea, have trades available all throughout the year. Don't just jam it all into a 1-week period. So maybe you make 3 or 4 trades right after WrestleMania to spark things up. But you don't have to trade 15, 20 guys like we saw, and then throughout the course of the year, if someone needs a new storyline or you just don't have a use for them on a particular show, then you can move them around. To me, that would make more sense and benefit the product and give some unpredictability throughout the course of the entire year.
Yeah, it's just, I didn't like the way it was done. And I mean, if you look back on the whole thing, when some of the people that came out to be moved from SmackDown onto Monday Night Raw, and then same with SmackDown, fans were kind of like, oh, okay, it's just him or it's just her. It wasn't really interesting, but I think one of the more devastating things that happened during this whole thing was the way in which NXT talent has been brought up the last 2 weeks. Monday Night Raw, as always, did a solid job with the post-WrestleMania with the bringing in of Ember Moon, kind of in a weird situation, but...
Yeah, I didn't really like that they brought her in with Nia, but I don't think long-term it's going to matter. I think she's going to have success.
And then, bringing back Bobby Lashley after WrestleMania, things like that. But then on SmackDown, it was just... you just had the Iconics, really. But then during the Superstar Shakeup, all of a sudden, Drew Galloway's on Monday Night Raw. And, by the way...
Drew McIntyre.
Yeah. Sanity's on SmackDown.
Yes.
Wait, they are? They didn't even get like a push on it. It was just like, and while we're going to flip through everybody that's coming to SmackDown, here comes Sanity, one of the more important pieces in NXT.
And the former NXT champion Andrade Cien Almas also joining the mix.
He got a little video montage, but I mean, the way they handled the NXT talent coming up, it was like, they're going to be on here. Who really cares? Because they were getting spots with like the Ascension, who goes to Monday Night Raw, and they're just flip flopping. And I think the way they handled the NXT talent was even worse than the way the whole Superstar shakeup as a whole went.
Let's touch on some of the big moves first on Monday Night Raw. The one that I want to start with really wasn't a surprise per se. It doesn't technically qualify as part of the Superstar shakeup, but it's Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn. Now, the storyline was they were off SmackDown after losing at WrestleMania. We wondered how they'd work around it. They didn't really get very creative here. They simply just said, Stephanie went over Kurt Angle's head, so the stipulation really meant nothing. They're now on Monday Night Raw. That's going to be, I think, big for Monday Night Raw to get guys of that caliber if they can continue to feature them like how SmackDown was, because Sami Zayn really was not used very well when he was on Raw the first time around. Kevin Owens was holding the Universal title for quite some time. But I think these guys, if they continue the ascension they had on SmackDown, they're going to be real key members, because to me, you look at the talent that they have both in the ring and now with their characters. I think Sami Zayn has really embraced this heel role, and he comes across as such an annoying jerk and Kevin Owens has always been great in that position. I think those two guys, I hope that they're used properly on Monday Night Raw and featured as well as they were on SmackDown, because they really could be top contenders. On a Raw roster, it looks a little bit thinner right now, especially on the heel side.
Yeah, I think Sami Zayn is very well due for a strong push. I think he definitely needs to at least have a chance at a mid-card title. Maybe if he gets the chance to feud with Seth Rollins for the Intercontinental title. But then again, you have so many preset storylines, and then you throw these guys into it. What for the next at least month? What are you going to, have done? I mean, how are you going to put these things into movement with the change in the superstars? And Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn, I both think, are going to be okay. And it's just difficult to tell. The way things are going to work out, I think there is going to be a re-flip-flop of the Intercontinental and the U.S. title when it comes Greatest Royal Rumble time. I still think the IC title has a chance to move to SmackDown. But it's all basis of it's just such a jumbled mess now. It really is. It's so hard to put into a thought that, okay, well, Sami Zayn, Kevin Owens, both great workers on SmackDown, involved in probably the best storyline on SmackDown over the last few months.
Yeah, I thought it was very good with Shane and Daniel Bryan.
Yeah, but now now they're put into a situation where they have no backstory with Monday Night Raw. They went on Monday Night Raw and had one head-to-head match, and now they're on Monday Night Raw. So where do you go from there? Do you split them up finally, have them feud for a little bit, and then allow them to go their separate ways as being heel? Do you find a way to turn Kevin Owens as a face and keep Sami Zayn as a heel, since it's worked for him more than the face run ever did? Or do you have Sami Zayn turn on Kevin Owens this time as a face, and then they split up that way? That's the only thing I can see working in the near future, is by splitting them up in some way, shape, or form and deciding, okay, which one's heel, which one's face, because they have nothing that can work right now unless, by some stretch of the matter, they end up working as a tag team within the Monday Night Raw tag team division.
I think at least for the first couple of weeks they probably will, and then maybe when you get to the middle of May or June, then they sort of have to figure out exactly how they want to go about it, because I don't think long-term those guys should work as a tag team. I think you're missing some opportunities if they do. This shakeup really started not in the most exciting manner, with Jinder Mahal being the first person to come over. No one was excited about that. That, I think, got things off on the wrong foot. While Jinder certainly has improved, as you've mentioned before, it's not a guy that interests anyone. I think everyone was happy to see him lose his U.S. title. Some of the other more prominent guys that came over to Raw, there was a decent number of additions, but I think ultimately they lost more than they gained. Bobby Roode's a guy that stands out, not because he's been great thus far, but because I think he can be much better with a fresh start. I would have loved to have seen him immediately come over and establish himself as a heel, maybe a dramatic turn in the main event. That starts to capture some attention and makes him a more prominent addition. That didn't happen. They kept him as a face, at least in the early going, so we'll see if they maybe change their mind on that. I don't know what to make of Bobby Roode, because I really thought he was good in NXT. Obviously, a lot of people were fans of his work before he came to the company altogether. To me, on the main roster, somewhat like Nakamura, he just hasn't been nearly as good, hasn't been interesting, and I think it's because they are sort of pigeonholing him with his heel characteristics and everything that worked as a heel in NXT, now trying to have that come across as a face. I think that maybe he'll find his footing, but for me, he's a guy right now that just needs something different. So I think the change in brand alone could help. I just don't know if he's ever going to reach his potential on Monday Night Raw, much like he failed to do so in his short run on SmackDown.
Yeah, I think Bobby Roode is one of the more talented guys on both rosters, just simply due to his, past and how long he has been at it, especially in a marquee brand, starting at TNA and, coming over to WWE finally. But Bobby Roode, and you said it perfectly. He has fallen into the Shinsuke Nakamura trap. SmackDown, and I have always called SmackDown the sideshow, just because you have to put together so many things into one small 2-hour window. And it doesn't allow for proper build of new incoming characters, and when you have to use limited time. When Monday Night Raw can establish a new character by using a promo and spending 15 minutes, 20 minutes on the promo, because then you still have 2 3/4 hours left. If you give up 20 minutes on SmackDown, you've used nearly a quarter of your show. So I think Bobby Roode
to this past week, they had a couple of matches that were like 2-minute matches. And that's sort of to your point, because they were trying to introduce a lot of people coming over via trade. You mentioned they really didn't highlight superstars getting the bump up from NXT at all on SmackDown. So I sort of agree that when they have busy shows on SmackDown and they have a lot they want to get to, they sort of just rush things together. And you do get, at least I would say once a month, shows where they have the feeling that, they're trying to do too much in too short of a period of time, and someone like a Bobby Roode maybe suffered from that at times.
Yeah, I really think he did. He had that short run with the United States title. I thought that was at least a smooth start for him, and that kind of put him in a different tier as Nakamura, because Nakamura hasn't had a run with any championship on SmackDown since he's come over. So I honestly thought Bobby Roode had a chance to hold the U.S. title for a decent period of time, but then you had to factor in Randy Orton needed to get his Grand Slam, because we got to make sure everybody who's close to getting a Grand Slam now gets it. And then Jinder Mahal wins it at WrestleMania for some reason, which now has no relevancy with him losing it 2 weeks later on Monday Night Raw to Jeff Hardy. But again, another Grand Slam champion now. So I want to see them develop the NXT talent more. If you're going to bring in NXT talent and not allow them to put on the matches that they put on in NXT, not allow them to live up to the full potential, showing how they're capable of carrying a show like they did in NXT, don't waste the time in bringing them up just yet then. If they're going to come up here and be in just mediocre, below average feuds with random people that really have no backstory as to why they're getting into these feuds, let them stay down in NXT. Maybe instead of bringing them up after WrestleMania, hold them in NXT and bring them up during SummerSlam, because it's the one thing you don't ever see in NXT is a champion ever being capable of getting their rematch. Because after WrestleMania, you have Cien Almas and Ember Moon both lose their title at TakeOver New Orleans, and now they're both on the main roster, so you're never going to get that opportunity to regain your title unless you stay at NXT. So until there is something that really is necessary to draw in these NXT guys, I think you keep them there and allow NXT to keep pushing the mold the way NXT does, and it allows more time on the roster now instead of bringing up so much more talent.
I want to touch on something that I think worked out pretty well on Monday night. That was the reintroduction of Drew McIntyre. He was a guy that was on the main roster. They really had no role for him after he debuted as the Chosen One, had a nice run, but then he sort of flatlined. They put him in 3MB. We all know about that. He comes back. He goes to NXT. I thought he had a pretty impressive run there, although his title reign shortened by injury. He lost the title to Andrade Cien Almas, I believe, the night before Survivor Series.
Yes.
Was injured in that match and just made his return recently. So how are they going to bring him back? Do they bring him back to NXT? Well, we find out instead they bring him back to Monday Night Raw. But they did something sort of interesting. I don't think many people anticipated that Dolph Ziggler would find himself in a pretty fresh and innovative storyline. That's exactly what happened. They have Dolph Ziggler come over in the shakeup to Raw. He comes out and says, basically, I'm not alone. And out of nowhere, Drew McIntyre comes and helps Dolph level Titus and Apollo Crews. I don't know. His name seemingly changes back and forth every week. Nonetheless, it's something that I think a lot of fans immediately liked how it came across. Ziggler's a guy that has all the talent, but just has been in stale storylines, hasn't had a lot of motivation to deliver his best because he doesn't usually get that opportunity to have the marquee matches and great storylines anymore.
And every time he breaks the glass ceiling, he gets hurt.
So they pair him with McIntyre, re-debuting on the main roster. And the immediate reaction from people going back 20-some years is Shawn Michaels and Diesel. It's easy to make that comparison. I don't think it's going to play out exactly the same by any means. But to me, this is exciting to see what they do with this because they had a very impressive debut. They had that really cool combination of their finishers with Dolph doing the zigzag and Drew doing the big boot, the Claymore. So to me, this is something that they probably, at least for the first week, they got it right with these guys.
Yeah, they did. And Dolph Ziggler is, and like I just mentioned, every time Dolph Ziggler finally gets that push, he gets hurt. And I think that's why WWE is so scared to utilize Dolph Ziggler in his most important role as one of the better performers on the roster. Is they're scared that, when they put a title on him, he always ends up hitting the shelf for a few months. So I think being on Monday Night Raw, it does allow Dolph Ziggler to have a fresh run, and he's one guy I would like to see maybe grab a world title one more time, just because of how interesting it was with him as the world champion during his run a few years ago. And I think this time around, Drew McIntyre is not going to have the same backstage problems he had early on. He really did play into that I am the chosen one, I can kind of just do whatever I want thing because of how high Vince McMahon was on him. And that's what put a sour note into him and how he ended up with 3MB and eventually out of the company, just because he really was a pain to work with in the back and was always a problem starter. So I think putting these two together, kind of putting McIntyre under Dolph's wing, is going to make for a solid couple months using these two together. And then, come the stretch run, maybe at SummerSlam even, if you put these two in a one-on-one match, it has the chance to be a fantastic match if you, down the line, break these two up.
Anything else that jumps out to you as far as what Raw picked up over this superstar shakeup? Again, you mentioned some of the call-ups that came the night after WrestleMania with Ember Moon, Authors of Pain, No Way Jose. They got Bobby Lashley back. This past week, Drew McIntyre gets the call up, and again, they got, I don't even know how many, but it had to have been at least 15 different guys from Raw. We didn't touch on some of them, but was there anything that really jumped out to you that's going to help Monday Night Raw going forward with this shakeup?
I think the addition of the Riot Squad, surprisingly, is going to add a different intrigue to the women's division.
So they basically swapped with Mandy Rose and Sonya Deville at this point.
But Mandy Rose and Sonya Deville, at least right now, are not at that caliber of competing for the women's championship. They still have some work to do, and I'm completely okay with them moving to SmackDown to stick around with Paige, because Paige has been their veteran that has led the way for them, and she can continue to do so and continue to work with them to build them up over time. But Ruby Riott is someone that has the potential, more so than the other four between Absolution and the Riott Squad, to put together a complete clean match and be in the women's championship conversation, because she's already had a women's title match against Charlotte over on SmackDown. So Ruby Riott isn't far away, and I think she adds a different dimension to the women's division. But for Monday Night Raw, I think the tag team division now is completely depleted. You have the Authors of Pain, you have the Revival, you lose the Bar, and now you're in complete chaos with the tag team division. You bring in Breezango, the Fashion Police. You bring in the Ascension, two tag teams that are just squashed on SmackDown every time they hit the ring. And then the rest of the tag teams on Monday Night Raw are just makeshift tag teams that they put together.
Right, and so the Hardys definitely are separated. I don't know that they ever had plans to put them back as a tag team going forward, but that's not a possibility at this point. Anderson and Gallows, I don't think they are a massive loss. But to your point, it looks a little ugly on the Raw side with the tag team division. And I'm always a fan of true tag teams staying together, not just throwing two guys because you don't have anything better for them. But you get the feeling that probably for the time being, that's what it's going to be like on Monday Night Raw.
Yeah, going over to SmackDown, I think SmackDown did pick up some solid pieces along the way. And
you're a popular man.
Yeah, I know. Tell me about it. But no, it's just, I don't think SmackDown. I think SmackDown got too many valuable pieces.
So you and I sort of differed on this, at least initially, where I mentioned that I thought SmackDown is now the wrestling show. You look at maybe some of the bigger veteran names will probably still be on Monday Night Raw. And Monday Night Raw is always going to have a little bit more in terms of surprise. That just seems like how the show's presented. If something big's going to happen, usually it's on Monday Night Raw. But I think SmackDown is really catering towards the indie fan base at this point with some of the names that they have over there. And it could be a show that, if they give enough time for the in-ring performers, can really deliver, much like the SmackDown in the early 2000s, where you had guys like Edge, Christian, Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero all over there giving great matches. You had some of the more established big-name characters over on Raw the other side. It looks like it could resemble that again here in 2018.
Yeah, SmackDown's going to get a little more interesting just with the names they brought in. But at the same time, too, they bring in Asuka, which, I mean, there's no reason why Asuka shouldn't be the women's champion at any time within the next 3 months. Just because I think you have to have Charlotte beat Carmella, and you really need to set up the rematch of Charlotte versus Asuka, hopefully for SummerSlam down the line. But again, it's just another setting where the tag teams, it's just getting old. You really only have, with the addition of Sanity, however, but you only have really three tag teams that are tag team title worthy. And you bring in Anderson and Gallows as well, but I mean, have they been Raw Tag Team Champions? Yes, but they can't seem to find anything to do with those two guys. And everybody to this point is just getting so sick of seeing the New Day versus the Usos, because while they put on fantastic matches, it's the same thing every 3 months. It's Usos versus New Day, then it's New Day versus Bludgeon Brothers versus Usos. It's just the same 3 tag teams right now. And before the Bludgeon Brothers became a thing, it was just the Usos and the New Day. So when is SmackDown finally going to change things up within the tag team division? And now I think with AJ Styles, you give him fresh competition without having to move him to Monday Night Raw. And I think matchups with Daniel Bryan down the line, Samoa Joe down the line, I think it adds to more intrigue in the WWE title picture rather than the Universal title picture.
I want to stick with the women's side that you mentioned real quickly. So Asuka going over is significant. That was the biggest move on the women's side. And I thought there would be more action on the women's side as far as big names. I expected either Sasha or Bayley to move the SmackDown. Didn't happen. And sort of I'm glad that it didn't, because I think maybe keeping those two together, hopefully you get the conclusion that we all want to see with a great storyline between those two. Excuse me. But Asuka moving over, and really her replacement on Raw is Natalya. That's not in any way an even swap between the two. The other transactions were the Riot Squad and the remaining members of Absolution switching. So I think that sort of offsets to an extent. To me, Asuka really boosts the women on SmackDown. The problem I have with that is when you look now, your top 3 women on SmackDown, Asuka, Charlotte, Becky Lynch. They're all faces. So they're going to have to do something there, because if they try to make Carmella and the Iconics, Peyton Royce and Billie Kay, the 3 that oppose those 3 top faces, it's not going to be an even fight. So I'm curious to see what they do. If they maybe turn Asuka, I don't think they're going to turn Becky Lynch. She seems like it's just too natural of a face. And it would sort of be hard to switch Charlotte over to the heel side now, but I suppose that's an option. What do you see as far as how they're ultimately going to handle having all of their top competitors on the women's side on SmackDown be faces? Are they going to just try to use a Carmella, a Peyton, a Billie Kay, maybe a Sonya Deville and Mandy Rose to fill those heel spots, or are they going to have to ultimately turn one of the big 4, really, if you factor Naomi in, probably the 4th best worker on SmackDown, also a face?
I think the smart decision would be turning Charlotte over as the heel, just because she's had that run already and it worked. But at the same time, Charlotte has become way too important for SmackDown since she's changed over to a face. And now Charlotte has the whole background with, the young girls and everything. And she's kind of like the John Cena of the women's division now. And I would be intrigued to see Asuka turn heel. Just because with how capable Asuka is, and I honestly think she's the best in-ring women's wrestler in the division, both sides. Make her turn her into a heel and allow her over the next shred of time. Give her a reason as to why, instead of just praising Charlotte for breaking her streak, turn Asuka heel.
That would be easy. That's a pretty easy route if they wanted to take it. Now, I will say that Asuka, for a lot of her time in NXT, sort of was in between. She, at times, kind of looked like a heel in how she handled things, but they never really made her fully a heel. I think back to her feud with Ember Moon down in NXT. She did kind of seem like she was a heel, but again, they sort of used her depending on who she was going against. Since she's been on the main roster, she's clearly been a face, but I think this could be maybe the opportunity to switch her over. Speaking of heels and someone who has excelled as a heel recently, another big acquisition for SmackDown, another person that sort of fits the mold of a big-time, great in-ring worker who really garners the attention of the indie fans, is Samoa Joe. And Joe going over was a big surprise. You mentioned it before. It sort of sidetracks his storyline with Roman Reigns, and likely after those two battle in a couple weeks, that'll be the end of it, you figure. But he could be an impact player on SmackDown, and a guy that I think probably, if he stays healthy, again, you mentioned how important it is to stay healthy when you're getting that push. If Joe stays healthy, I think we're looking at a world champion before the year's over for him on SmackDown.
Definitely a world champion, and in my personal opinion, I think an intercontinental champion coming up here in a week. I really think Samoa Joe is going to claim the IC title for SmackDown Live at the Greatest Royal Rumble, and that's when you get Jinder Mahal beating, Jeff Hardy for the awe factor for the Saudi Arabian crowd. So I see those titles flip-flopping, and I think Samoa Joe's the centerpiece of the mid-card division over on SmackDown for the next, few months to build his way up into a feud with potentially AJ Styles. And even if by that point Shinsuke Nakamura gets the title put on him, having Joe and Nakamura relive their NXT time together on SmackDown Live, I think it would play an interesting piece.
I think that Jeff Hardy's a nice addition to SmackDown because he's a guy that immediately goes into the high mid-card. Probably doesn't have to be a world title contender anytime soon, maybe down the road. One thing that they teased right off the bat was him and Randy Orton. And to me, that interests me. I know a lot of people think Randy Orton's stale, and I totally get that. And his storyline that was on the horizon with Jinder, that would have been bad. That would have been worst case scenario for Randy Orton. Thankfully, that looks like it's in the rearview mirror. But with Jeff Hardy and Randy Orton, I could see that being interesting. They both go in as faces. Maybe you tease Orton turning heel in this scenario. Maybe ultimately he does. I think that's a role that he's even better at than when he's playing a face. So Jeff Hardy comes over. Clearly, they did not want him being part of the Matt Hardy storyline going forward. Does Jeff Hardy sort of fill a void on SmackDown as a high mid-card guy that can hold the U.S. title, but could also maybe work main event storylines going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. He's done it in the past, and Jeff Hardy has that ability to, and I think definitely over Matt, be able to, push the mold and come close to becoming a world champion, while Matt has, done it just as long and has had as much success as Jeff within the tag team division. Matt just doesn't bring that intrigue that Jeff Hardy does to the main event caliber level, which is why I think you'll see Jeff Hardy working in main events on SmackDown Live and maybe getting that title shot here or there for the title. Not saying you put it on him, but Jeff he's the charismatic enigma. That's what they call him, and he brings that charisma every time. And he's been a fan favorite for years, and I don't see why Jeff shouldn't get a chance to have one more world title shot when the other ones he had in the past were cut short.
We talked about some of the NXT additions that were announced. Sanity minus Nikki Cross, which I think is a little weird to cut her out, at least for the time being. Maybe she'll come up later. Andrade Cien Almas, Zelina Vega. I am very high on Almas for his in-ring work, and I think he was missing something when he debuted in NXT. Zelina Vega in a heel turn really changed his character around. I think he's going to help boost an already impressive in-ring group of performers there on SmackDown. And I mentioned Jeff Hardy maybe being a mid-card champion / low-level main eventer. I think Andrade Cien Almas would be a guy that could work very well with him right off the bat and sort of be in that same caliber. But one guy that I don't think a lot of people were talking about was Big Cass. He had been injured. They had big plans for him on Monday Night Raw. He got injured right after finishing up his storyline with Enzo Amore, right around SummerSlam. Had an ACL injury. Comes back now, and he looks like he's in line for a massive push. Fans like it or not, it looks like it's going to be him against Daniel Bryan. I think a little bit peculiar to have Daniel Bryan really thrust into a storyline with Big Cass and Daniel Bryan's return as a full-time regular. Glad to see that Daniel Bryan stayed on SmackDown. I thought for sure he was going to Raw and that The Miz would stay over there. Instead, they bring The Miz to SmackDown to keep Daniel Bryan there. But his storyline with Big Cass, I don't know what they're going to do with this because you want to push Cass. He's coming back. They think he's going to be a big star. By the same token, this guy really can't beat Daniel Bryan yet, can he?
Well, that's the thing, and I think this is why it is a smart decision on WWE's behalf, because it allows Big Cass to finally work with main event level superstars. The whole thing, when he turned on Enzo, he never got the chance to really break into the main event level scene and work with main event caliber talent because of the injury cutting things short for him. So I think working with Daniel Bryan allows Daniel Bryan to get him into a position where he can work with the main event level talent. It builds Big Cass's credibility as a heel going after the most beloved character in the WWE in Daniel Bryan. And it can only further Big Cass's push using this feud.
So quickly, just wrapping up the Superstar shakeup on the SmackDown side, anything that really stood out that we haven't highlighted that you particularly liked or thought maybe was the wrong decision? For me, I just think that SmackDown got a heck of a lot better in the ring, and that's really going to appeal to a certain fan base. I'm interested to see what they do with the call-ups, especially Andrade Cien Almas. But you have Nakamura and AJ continuing, it appears. Daniel Bryan now in a prominent storyline with Big Cass. And then you have guys like Jeff Hardy, Randy Orton that are probably going to be high mid-card. Samoa Joe's going to be an X factor. I think you could throw him in any number of storylines and have him make an immediate impact. So to me, with the addition of Asuka on the women's side and adding Anderson and Gallows, and particularly the Bar, if those two stay together, I think you can say SmackDown got better in terms of the men's singles division, the tag team division, and the women's division all at the same time.
Yeah, you said it perfectly. The only thing I would have liked to have seen was maybe the Usos move over to Monday Night Raw, being that the New Day held down Monday Night Raw for so long. The Bludgeon Brothers are new and fresh in SmackDown. I would have liked to have seen the Usos move over to Monday Night Raw and kind of keep some intrigue into the tag team division on Monday Night Raw with gaining the Bar on SmackDown Live, because now you have the four best tag teams in the WWE all on one show.
And with the Usos, I thought that would freshen them up, and it could have done wonders for Naomi to go over to Raw as well with her husband, because I thought she's someone that really is going to be falling a little bit down the pecking order with Asuka coming over. But nonetheless, I think they did give the impression that both brands, to some extent, got better over the last couple of weeks when you factor in the call-ups as well as the trades, the new storylines. So I think it was, while I didn't like the method of going about the Superstar shakeup and how it's executed, I think talent-wise, both rosters really have an opportunity to deliver some great storylines and even more so some great in-ring action heading forward. So one thing we want to touch on here before we sign off, Sean, is a major loss in the wrestling world, one of the best of all time, and you and I, growing up in Pittsburgh, know the significance locally of Bruno Sammartino. He was a champion for over 6 consecutive years, the WWE champion, WWF back then. It's really unbelievable to think about the run that he had. Now, wrestling was a lot different back then, and you had lengthy title runs. You had guys that were main eventers day in and day out for years and years and years at a time. But his impact on the wrestling world was massive, and I grew up watching Hulk Hogan as the guy, but I think people maybe 10, 15 years older than me, Bruno Sammartino was their Hulk Hogan. And for you grow up with Stone Cold and The Rock as the top guys. He's 2 generations probably before that, but he was really the predecessor as a massive star that carried a company. He did it long before Hogan and Flair in the 80s, Rock and Austin in the 90s.
Yeah, Bruno Sammartino really was the straw that stirred what was the WWF, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, turning into the WWF, which is where we lie with the WWE now. If you don't see Bruno Sammartino in Vince Senior's promotion, you might not have what you have today in terms of the WWE. Bruno Sammartino, a trailblazer in this business and quite possibly one of the best to ever lace up the boots. He had tremendous talent in the ring. I've seen video clips in a couple matches of Bruno from the past, and just his ability in the ring. He is what made wrestling entertaining back in those days, selling out Madison Square Garden. What was it, a record time? Over 150 times he sold out Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, just unbelievable. And that was back when WWF, or as you mentioned, its predecessor, WWF, was pretty much Pennsylvania, New York, New England. He was the biggest star of territory wrestling back then. And again, for people like us, he was even bigger because this was the territory that he worked. He was, of course, known all throughout Pittsburgh, and he continued to live here. He's a guy that even if you weren't a wrestling fan, you lived in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you knew who Bruno Sammartino was in Pittsburgh.
You did. And it's not even just that. It's generations before us who got us into this sport and into wrestling. One of the first people you hear about is Bruno Sammartino. And just looking up his accomplishments, he had 2 title reigns that lasted 4,000 days. You're never going to see that ever again.
Yeah, I think it was, like 11 total years that he held the world title, something along those lines. Just absolutely mind-boggling. And when we had Justin Lowry filling in last week, I said right off the bat, how did you get into wrestling? He said, my dad grew up watching Bruno Sammartino. He passed down his wrestling interest to me. So my story with him is that my mom waited on him at a restaurant back when she was younger. Everyone said he was a great person, too, and someone that was very adamant about wrestling being done the right way, and he opposed WWF and WWE for quite some time after he left. He didn't like what they were doing during the Attitude Era. He got into the Hall of Fame just a handful of years ago because they showed him, we are changing. We're taking care of our performers. We have this stringent medical testing to make sure they don't have severe injuries. They're not getting concussions every single night. And Triple H really was key in getting him into the Hall of Fame. And I thought when he got into the Hall of Fame, that was really one of the biggest missing pieces to really give it credibility. Yes, there's a lot of stuff that the Hall of Fame for WWE does poorly, but getting the biggest stars, guys like Bruno Sammartino and Randy Savage, in later than they should have, but ultimately getting them in there, that to me was absolutely massive.
Yeah, listen, there are people from the past that still aren't in the Hall of Fame that definitely need to take their rightful place, but Bruno Sammartino was definitely one that I think added to what is already a fantastic Hall of Fame shrine. And Bruno Sammartino was that very first piece that was the puzzle of what the McMahon family was building. And like I mentioned, and I firmly believe this, if not for Bruno Sammartino being in the territory that he was at the time when territorial wrestling was such a huge thing, we might not be even sitting here today talking about the WWE.
Well, certainly our condolences, a major loss for not only professional wrestling, but for Pittsburgh and really, if you think about it, the world overall. But that's going to do it. We end on a sad note, but I hope you enjoyed our talk this week. And keep in mind, you can follow us on Twitter. The link right up here, 5-Star Pod Wrestle. Do some live tweeting during Raw, SmackDown, and pay-per-views. And check out our YouTube channel where we put all of our episodes up. We'll have them up on the Twitter as well. That's going to do it for episode number 4. We will be back next week. Hopefully, Sean will be able to join us again for episode number 5. For my colleague, Sean Saputo, Sean Meyers signing off again. You've been watching the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. Thank you for tuning in.